Hey everybody, it's MotherGoose27, and today we are going to be talking about Nagash and the Legions of Nagash, and whether or not they will be their own faction. This video is going to be pretty different from my other possible but unlikely Total War Warhammer 3 faction videos, because with other factions I've discussed, there wasn't much of a chance of them being added to the game, but with Nagash, he will most definitely be added in one way or another, and I'll be really surprised and honestly a little upset if he isn't. But the question is, will he have his own faction or just be a part of the vampire counts? We will also be discussing if he will actually be playable in-game or just be another quote-unquote god. I also won't really be covering the lore like I typically do just because Nagash is such a well-known character and I don't want to repeat information you already know. So, there is a lot to discuss and a lot of different routes CA could take, so let's get into it. First off, I think we need to talk about the followers of Nagash. The followers of Nagash are a Tomb Kings faction already in the game. They are a semi-hybrid faction between the Tomb Kings and the Vampire Counts, led by Nagash's biggest simp, Arkhan the Black. Now, I don't think we'll see Arkhan move to a different faction if Nagash does get his own faction, just because he's a part of a paid DLC that people have already paid for and will continue to pay for. So CA most likely wouldn't move him. But maybe a confederation or vassal mechanic for Nagash and Arkhan would work really well. No matter how they work it out, no matter what faction Nagash is a part of, I don't think Arkhan should be able to attack Nagash just because he is so loyal and, as I said earlier, the biggest simp. But I honestly believe the fact that Arkhan the Black was added to the Tomb Kings and not held back so he could be a part of Nagash's faction is a big point for Nagash not receiving his own faction in Total War Warhammer 3. But it could just be poor planning, and I know Arkhan is a Tomb Kings character. It makes sense they added him to the Tomb Kings, but I think it would have just made more sense to wait and add him to Nagash's faction if they were planning to give Nagash his own faction. Now that we've got the followers of Nagash out of the way, let's talk about Nagash as a Vampire Counts legendary lord. This is definitely a possibility. Nagash could serve as a Vampire Counts lord officially, and he could still be a hybrid faction like the followers of Nagash, still having access to Tomb Kings and Vampire Coasts units, but stay under the Vampire Counts umbrella. This definitely could work, but I personally wouldn't want this. Nagash is such a unique character with so much lore, and he literally is the master of necromancy and a god of the undead. It would just be weird having him be a part of just one faction. I think it would make the most sense to give him his own hybrid faction. Another possibility we could see is Nagash as a quote-unquote god. With the Chaos Gods and the Dragon Emperor not being playable in-game, it's completely possible that Nagash could just be another god character. An outside force, our undead heroes, must aim to please to progress in their campaigns. This is also a possibility I really wouldn't want to see play out. The main reason I'm afraid of this happening is the Dragon Emperor himself. We all expected the Dragon Emperor, but CA, I can't remember the exact quote, but they said he's basically revered as a god, so he won't be playable. He kind of serves like the Chaos Gods. But the Dragon Emperor and the Chaos Gods were not actually playable on tabletop, while Nagash was in Fantasy Battle and still in Age of Sigmar. So I couldn't really see CA and Games Workshop not adding him to Total War Warhammer 3, but I just felt like this was another possibility we needed to discuss today. If he actually is a playable character in the game, he will be incredibly powerful, while most likely still receiving some major nerfs compared to his lore-accurate self, but he definitely has the potential to be the most powerful legendary lord we actually see in-game, and the most expensive. Another unknown would be Neferata, the first vampire. I personally would like to see her stay in the same faction as Nagash, but she would work really well as Vampire Count's legendary lord. I'm not really going to spend a lot of time talking about her, but what faction would you like to see her in? Honestly, just me personally, if Nagash does get his own faction, I really would be surprised not to see Neferata in it. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about the Legions of Nagash and the possibility of it being its own faction. For Legendary Lords, I would love to see, of course, Nagash, and then a representative from each of the other Undead factions. So Neferata for the Vampire Counts, Arkan ideally for the Tomb Kings, which we've already discussed would most likely not happen and have to be someone else, and an Undead Captain for the Vampire Coasts. And I'm not gonna lie, I was doing some research for this video in terms of who these characters could be, and I got on some forums, and you guys are vicious. I'm not even gonna bring up names because I just read argument after argument of why certain characters could or couldn't work for the Legions of Nagash, so I'm just leaving it in the air. I would like to see a representative from each of the factions. That's what I'm saying. You guys can discuss it in the comments. In terms of main mechanics, I think the Legions of Nagash would focus on conquering the other Undead factions and forcing them to serve. Except Cetra, of course. And I know I'm not the first YouTuber to point this out, but you could have the units locked behind an objective of conquering or defeating other undead legendary lords. So let's say before you have access to all or most of the Vampire Count's units, you have to defeat a certain number of Vampire Count legendary lords and conquer their settlements. This way you could kind of pick and choose which factions you really want to focus on. And again, other YouTubers have pointed this out. I know for sure the Great Book of Grudges has talked about it, and I'm sure other YouTubers have as well. He's just the last one that I've heard mention it. The last thing I really want to talk about in terms of mechanics would be a United Undead event. Maybe like an Undead invasion the player would have to fight through. I know some of you would probably hate this idea, but I would love to see almost all of the Undead factions united under Nagash trying to conquer the world, and I think it would add a really friendly addition alongside the already Chaos Invasion and Order Tide. In terms of his actual army, I think this could be a really cool way to introduce a lot of the missing units for the other Undead factions. Just include these missing units with the Legions of Nagash. So yes, we would get a mix of the three factions, but still get some never before seen units. So yes, we would get a mix of the other three factions, but still get some new units. And we could still add these units to the other Undead factions. This way, the other Undead factions still get a nice update, get some of the units they're missing, but Nagash could still enter the game with some never before seen units. These could include, but are not limited to, the Lich High Priest, the Karen Wraith, which is basically just a lower tier Banshee. We could see some infantry, like the Spirit Hosts, which is just an ethereal swarm. I would love it if they brought mummies back, but I don't necessarily think they will. We could see the Bone Thrower Artillery. In terms of monsters, we could see the Bat Swarm, which is just like the Fell Bats, but smaller and in larger numbers, but they serve very similar roles. I would love to see the Kimric Titan in game. No matter how we get it, I just want this unit in game. Usopti with great weapons, another unit that is needed in the game. And then really the only Vampire Coast unit here would be the Razortooth Rats. And then in terms of mounts, we could see the Abyssal Terror, which are flying creatures of chaos stitched together by vampires and necromancers. And they're basically like a smaller Terrorgeist. And then lastly, the Coven Throne. Again, it could be a mount, but it could also serve as an actual unit. And it's kind of like the Mortis engine, but it focuses more on debuffing enemies. These are all really unique units from the other three factions I would really want to see in game and can make a good addition to the Legions of Nagash. And it doesn't just have to be new units. We could still see some recolored versions of the undead units already in the game. In terms of unique units, we of course would have the Morghasts. They are some of Nagash's most iconic units. And again, however Nagash is actually added to the game, the Morghasts are a unit I just really want to see. We could also see some human followers of Nagash, and honestly, they could serve whatever role CA and Games Workshop need them to fill. And lastly, it could be a way to introduce the jade-blooded vampires, but they never actually serve Nagash in lore, and so I don't really think they would be added to Nagash's faction, but I just wanted to bring it up as maybe. I really want to see the jade-blooded vampires in-game, but I want to see them added to Cathay. Could possibly be added to the vampire counts, but I really think they'd work best in Cathay. So before I end this video, I just want to leave you guys with a couple questions. Should Nagash be a legendary lord or a quote-unquote god character like the Dragon Emperor? Then, should Nagash have his own faction, or do you want him to be a part of the vampire counts? And lastly, should Nagash have access to all of the undead units, or just a mix of them to form a balanced faction? What are your thoughts? Let's discuss in the comments. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to join the flock, and I will see you in the next one. Mother Goose out.